If you would be turning your Bibles to Acts chapter 4, Acts chapter 4. If you have your notes in the outline, you can set that aside. I'm not going to be following it. That's just for your digestion and study later. Acts chapter 4, if you'll be turning there. In Acts chapter 4, recall that Peter and John are still continuing to preach at Jerusalem. We've gone through the day of Pentecost now. They're continuing to preach there. They're instructed by the Jewish leaders in Acts 4, verse 17, to no longer preach in his name. We all recall, of course, the response of verse 19. It's a popular response. We're familiar with it. We've heard it preached on many a times. But they say, whether it be right in the sight of God to hearken unto you rather than unto God, more than unto God, judge ye. You make that judgment. Should we continue to listen to you or listen to what God told us to do? But there's a very interesting statement in the next verse, in verse 20, Acts 4, verse 20. And Peter and John continue to answer there. And they basically say, we can but speak the things. I want you to note that they're addressing the things that they speak. We can but speak the things that we have seen and heard. We can but speak the things that we have seen and heard. That's a very important concept. Not only is it important to this context of their response to them, but he's identifying it within this context that, look, we haven't come and spoken mythology to you or to made anything up. We've come and only declared to you what we saw with our own eyes, what we've heard with our own ears. That makes us witnesses in their classic definition of a witness, Acts chapter 1, and that's what we're proclaiming to you. We haven't come up with this ourselves, because all we're limited to on earth is to proclaim the things that we've taken in with our senses. This has been this empiricism, this concept of the things that we take in through our five senses, has been studied for hundreds of years prior to this. You can go and read about Aristotle was the biggest one who spoke about what we're limited to in our speech is what we take in. Jesus confirmed that when he talks about our speech comes from our heart. But the concept being all we're limited to as far as what we speak on earth is what actually we take in on earth. Now, if you go back to John chapter 3, John the Apostle, in John chapter 3, is going to be contrasting John the Immerser with Jesus Christ. That's the context in John chapter 3. In John chapter 3, in the middle of verse 31, we're going to start in the middle of verse 31, then we'll get back to the rest of it in a moment. In John 3, verse 31, he says, he that is of the earth is earthly, and speaketh of the earth. That doesn't mean he just talks about earthly things. That's talking about the earth is the origins of what he speaks. That's what we're limited to. It's the exact same thing we saw with Peter and John. John the Apostle, again, is confirming within this context. Now, what he's going to note is, if you go back to verse 27, he's not saying that John the Immerser made things up. In verse 27, that very chapter, John the Immerser says that you can't receive anything except it's given to you by the Father in heaven. So his word was from above. His message was from above. But what's being contrasted in John 3 is where John is from versus where Jesus is from. So if you back up to John 3 and verse 30, one of my favorite verses in all the Bible, John the Immerser is going to say, he must increase, but I must decrease. Why is that true? Why is it the case that Jesus must increase and John the Baptizer must decrease? It's not because John was lying to him. It's not because John wasn't the greatest prophet born of a woman. That's not it. The context is because of his origins. He was of the earth in origin. So what he's limited to is what he was testified to or what was given to him on earth. Now, I want you to note what he goes on to say there in verse 31. Look at the beginning of verse 31. But he that cometh from above is above all. John 3 and verse 31. He that cometh from above is above all. Both of their messages were from above, but John came from the earth, Jesus came from above. What does that enable Jesus to do that John could not do? Verse 32 tells us that. Look in John 3 verse 32. He says, therefore, that what I speak and what I hear, that I testify. Now look at the contrast he's making here. John is limited to what he has seen and heard on earth, and that's what he testifies of. Jesus is not limited to earth because he came from heaven. Therefore, what is Jesus able to do that John can't? He can testify about what he has seen and heard in heaven. John can't do that. Go back to John chapter 1. In John chapter 1, John the Apostle has been arguing this way since the beginning of John. In John chapter 1, verse 18, we're familiar with this verse, I think. John 1, verse 18. John the Apostle argues that no man has seen God at any time. That's God the Father within the context. No man has taken in through empirical senses God the Father. So that's the problem if God wants to know us. Because what's the solution? The fact that none of us has ever observed God the Father ourselves. Well, he goes on to describe it, doesn't it? Begotten Son, who's in the bosom of the Father. Westcott and Hort said, adds theos the second time to that verse and says the only God, because Jesus is God, by the Father's side. That's what's being indicated there. The only God by the God side has declared, has exegeted him unto us. We didn't research it and find it out. The Son had to come from heaven and tell us perfectly and declare perfectly without flaw what the Father in heaven was like. And so we say things like, if I want to know what the Father would be thinking, I just need to look at what Jesus was thinking. If I want to know what the Father would say, I would see what Jesus would say. If I want to know how the Father would act on earth, I would look at how Jesus acted. He is perfectly exegeting, declaring heaven unto earth, because earth couldn't find it out unless heaven declared it unto him. Go with me to John chapter 8. Jesus says the same thing about himself in John chapter 8 and verse 23. I don't want to belabor this point, but I really want to set the stage for what we're going to get into. That's why I say don't follow the outline, because I'm not. In John 8 and verse 23, Jesus says, "Ye are from beneath, I am from above." Ye are from beneath, I am from above. How many times did the Jews try to stone Jesus because of this teaching? His origins. I'm not from the same place as you. And they would go try to stone him. You can read verse 28 and it says the same thing, but look in verse 26. John 8 and verse 26. What does the fact that they are from beneath and he is from above do? Well, Jesus describes the fact that the things that he speaks and the things that he declares and the things that he testifies of came from the Father. That's what I testify of, John 8 and verse 26. So Jesus came and told us heavenly things, John 8. Go back to John chapter 6. John chapter 6 and go to verse 44. John chapter 6, beginning verse 44. An often misrepresented and misunderstood passage. But Jesus says, "No man comes unto the Father except the Father draw him." Now, you need to spend time understanding how the Father will draw you, or else you'll think that God, the Father, draws you through nudges and feelings and emotions and zaps you with some kind of feeling. The Father's drawing you, or he draws you through Calvinism against your will. You don't want to come, but you have to come. That's not how God draws man. He will say in this context how he draws him. It is written in the prophets. That, by the way, is how he draws man. He gives you the answer to it. It is written in the prophets. And he quotes from Isaiah 54 and verse 13. Look what he quotes concerning Isaiah 54 and verse 13. The Father is going to teach you, and when those who learn of him will be drawn unto him. That's the description there. God the Father has used the prophets in days past. He was now in those days, Hebrews 1 verses 1 and 2, using the Son to draw mankind unto him, to reveal heaven unto them and draw them unto God. But look in verse 46. This is not in contrast or conflict with what we read in John 1:18, because he repeats it in John 6:46. Not that any man has seen the Father. That doesn't change that fact, John 6 and verse 46. It doesn't change. We don't know because we saw him. That's what he's reiterating that. Not that anyone has seen the Father, save who? The one from God or of God. That's who knows. He knows in a way that we do not know, that mankind never knew. This, by the way, if you look in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, go to 1 Corinthians chapter 2. Paul's going to address this. The Son was not the only one who declared heaven unto mankind. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, beginning in verse 9, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, beginning in verse 9, Paul identified the fact that eye hath not seen nor ear heard, those things that God has prepared for them that love him. Now, some people read that verse and say, oh, that means no one's seen heaven. That's true, but that's not what that verse is talking about. That verse is talking about we have not of our own physical investigation perceived heavenly things. It's not been based on our own physical investigation. It's not me taking my ear up into heaven and finding things out. It's not me taking my eyes up into heaven to find things out. He says in verse 10, but God hath revealed them unto us by his Spirit. The Spirit came from heaven. So this is all he's talking about. He's talking about it was not my eye or ear. It was God, heaven, revealing them unto mankind. That's God's process. If I'm going to know anything outside of what is empirical, that's why if you limit yourself to the quote-unquote scientific method, you're never going to find God, because that doesn't take into account God's revelation, which came from heaven. Now, I want you to imagine for a moment this afternoon, I want you to imagine that heaven wants to reveal a pattern unto earth. And not only does heaven want to reveal a pattern unto earth, heaven then expects earth to follow that pattern. I want you to think about that for a moment. What would have to happen in order for God in heaven to reveal a pattern unto man and for that man on earth to be expected to follow it? I want you to think about that. Our lesson over the next few days deals with the tabernacle. So it goes me to Exodus chapter 25. I'm going to try not to, in my very general approaching of this topic, I'm going to try not to touch on too many people's future topics, well, I imagine will be future topics. But in Exodus chapter 25, I just want to point out in verse 9, Exodus 25 and verse 9, that we have such a scenario being presented in the pattern of the tabernacle. So you note in Exodus 25 and verse 9, he references the pattern of the tabernacle, as well as the instruments within the tabernacle. Everyone sees that. And if you go down to verse 40, he's going to repeat it again. Verse 40 is going to be quoted in Hebrews 8:5, which we'll get to in a moment. Terrence was right. It's almost like he knew what Hebrews said. I am going to get to Hebrews in a moment. It's going to be quoted. Verse 40 says it again. According to the pattern that was shown thee on the mount. That is heaven revealing a pattern concerning the tabernacle. If you were to go to the book of Numbers, Numbers chapter 8 and verse 4, Numbers 8 and verse 4 includes within that pattern the candlestick, for example. The candlestick was a part of God's pattern revealed unto man. And so we ask the question, once God has revealed this pattern of the tabernacle unto mankind, and he expects mankind to obey it, what is the purpose of that pattern? How important was it that Moses follow that pattern exactly as God revealed it? Now we will say sometimes, well, this describes for us the fact that God expects very specific obedience to his law. And we use that sometimes as our response to that. And I agree with that. I'm not trying to deny that at all. We say, if God gives us something specific, he wants us to follow, he expects us to follow it specifically the way that he laid it out. Yes, I got to check there, Leslie. You never stop distracting me. Okay, that's exactly the way God laid it out. You have examples like that we use sometimes the Noah's flood. We use the ark, don't we? And we say, what if Noah had decided not to use gopher wood? Well, I imagine it would have sank, probably. It wouldn't have floated. But that's a pattern that God gave, and he had to follow it specifically. Think about 2 Samuel chapter 7, which we'll get to in a moment, with the pattern of the temple. God's going to reveal a temple pattern also. How important was it that they follow it specifically to that? Think of 2 Kings chapter 5 with Naaman. We talked about Naaman and how he was told to go to the Jordan River and dip 7 times. And we bring up the fact he doesn't say 6, he doesn't say 3, he doesn't say 8, he doesn't say 0. And he says, I want you to go dip in the Jordan River, which means that omits any river in Damascus. And we say, therefore, God demands specific obedience. And I completely agree with that. But what if there's another whole second level to which God is trying to get across to man when he says, here's a pattern, follow it? Well, there's a whole additional level to that what's happening in that pattern is God is revealing something in heaven for which he wants to look down from heaven and see and hear things that look like heaven to him. What if that's happening on another level? What if God's saying, Moses, when y'all get done with this tabernacle, I want to hear things coming out of that tabernacle which are heavenly in origin. I want to see things when I see that tabernacle which are a picture of heaven. What if that's the second level? And what if Moses decided, I know God said to take this altar and make it bronze on the outside, but gold is prettier than bronze, so I'm going to make the altar on the outside made of gold. And I know that labor is supposed to be before you go in the tabernacle, but I think people are not going to want to watch the priest wash. So let's put it on the inside of the tabernacle so that the priest can go in and wash, which is Baptist doctrine, by the way. If you know the typology there, let's wash after we go in. After we're priests, let's wash. If Moses changed those things, you know what? I want people to see the fact the fires are always burning, so let me take the lampstand and put it outside of the tabernacle. What if Moses had done that? We would think, well, he didn't follow God specifically. But on another level, God is now looking down and saying, this doesn't look heavenly anymore. Amen. What if that's the level? In 2 Samuel chapter 7, you remember 2 Samuel chapter 7, David is in his own house. He's in his own sealed house. It's built it, and he's resting well and has a great deal of peace around him. And he says, you know what? It's not fair, because man gets to decide what's fair and not. It's not fair that God has to dwell in that tent over there, and I'm in this nice house. So let me build God a house. And David went to Nathan and said, do what's in your heart. Could you imagine if David had been in charge of building the temple just through earth? Remember, all he can do is use what he knows on earth. So what if he decided, I'm going to build this thing to God on earth. I'm going to make it 100 times the size of my house. I have 3 hallways. I'm going to give God 8 hallways. And he just thought like a man thinks and then builds God's house. What did God say? I didn't ask you to build your house. I've dwelt in this tent for all these years. I never asked you to. So we get from that the idea of silence does not permit Silence does not permit. It tells you exactly what God wants. But he goes on in look in verse 11. I'm going to build the house. Does everybody see that in verse 11? Why is God going to build the house? Why does God have to give the pattern to Solomon to follow to build the temple? Why? Because he wants it to look heavenly. Otherwise, it's going to look very earthly. That's what we're talking about. This is an important aspect that the New Testament is getting into when it describes Jesus as coming from above. He's revealing heavenly things that we are not going to have any idea of unless heaven tells us about it, because we've never been there. That's a very important level and aspect of the tabernacle. I want you to go over to Hebrews chapter 8 now. Hebrews chapter 8. I believe that's exactly what's going on with the tabernacle. In Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 2, it describes Jesus Christ. In Hebrews 8, well, the whole book does. But Hebrews 8 and verse 2 is describing the fact that he is a servant of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle. The true tabernacle. The Lord pitched and man didn't. So the Lord pitched it. We're not talking about the physical tent. We know that for a fact because the Lord pitched this one. He is the servant of the true tabernacle. Now, we'll go on to describe that fact. All priests, in verse 3, every priest, what they are ordained to do is to offer sacrifices and gifts unto God. Jesus Christ could not have done that on earth. In verse 4, because he could not have been a priest on earth, he had to go back to heaven in order to be a priest. But I want you to know what verse 5 says. Who there, I think, I'm really big on pronouns. I teach grammar at the school, but I continue to stress it. It's very important you know what the antecedent of pronouns are, or you're going to miss the purpose of verses. Who, in that context, is the priesthood? Who is the service of the priesthood? Who is the tabernacle, that physical tabernacle? Who? That's the description there in verse 5. He talks about them being an example or a shadow of heavenly things. Everybody see that in verse 5? A shadow of heavenly things. Now, they are themselves the shadow. They're not the thing given the shadow. They're the shadow. That's what he's describing there. And then he goes off and quotes what we read in Exodus 25, verse 40, just a few moments ago. And so he says, since they're a shadow of heavenly things, God told Moses, make sure you follow the pattern revealed to you on the mount. Why? Because it was something heavenly. That's what Hebrews 8 and verse 5 says. When you look at that word in chapter 8 and verse 5 of pattern, I would encourage you to look up that word pattern there in the Greek. It's the Greek word tupos. That was the introduction to typology. The Greek word tupos is from where we get typology. It is a representation of something else. So he says those are types of something heavenly. That's what Hebrews 8 and verse 5 says. And in order for them to understand that, the heavenly had to be revealed unto them. Now, when you come to types, it's not just the tabernacle. There's many types that you find in Scripture. In fact, I would point out, look in Romans chapter 6 and verse 17. I would like to point out that the doctrine itself is a type of something heavenly. Romans 6 and verse 17. The teaching, the pattern itself was something heavenly. It's not just the thing itself, it's actually God's mind put into words that is itself a pattern. Because he talks about it here and in Titus chapter 2 verse 7. In Romans 6 verse 17, but God be thanked that ye were the servants or the slaves, the bondservants of sin, but ye have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine. Look up that word form there. Tupos. It's a type. It's a type of doctrine. What type is it? It's a type of heavenly doctrine. So we're going to see as we go through the next few days, even our obedience to the gospel is based on a heavenly pattern. It's a type. Titus 2 verse 7, he says it to the young men. Teach the young men. He talks about their actions themselves, the way that they live is actually a pattern, as used in Titus 2 verse 7. Type. It's the type of the way all of us should live. But I want you to note in Titus 2 verse 7, he says in doctrine. The doctrine itself is a type. It's a type because it's from heaven. So let me for a moment stray from what I'm talking about to preach a little bit. If you want to know why it is not okay to mess around with God's doctrine, and if you want to know why messing around with God's doctrine is messing around with souls, this is one of the reasons. You're messing with heaven. When you mess around with the doctrine, you're messing around with heaven. Don't think it's something small. I'm going to take this doctrine of God, I'm going to tweak it a little bit, make it a little bit, not follow the pattern entirely. I'm going to change it a little bit. I'm going to make it look like this. It still looks a little bit like it. And you mess around with God's doctrine, you're messing with heaven. That's what the Bible's saying. John chapter 7, verse 24, Jesus says, my doctrine is not mine. It's the one who sent me. So when you mess with doctrine, you're messing around with God in heaven's doctrine. You're messing around with his word, something heavenly. This is why we don't mess around with doctrine. This is why we take doctrine seriously, because it deals with souls and it deals with heaven and heaven's relationship to mankind. You don't mess around with doctrine. Remember Matthew chapter 16. Matthew 16, Peter has made that great confession or profession, if you will. I believe that you are Jesus, you're the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed that unto you, but my Father in heaven. Which means Jesus, being the Son of God, is heavenly in origin as far as a doctrine goes. And then lo and behold, as we know what happens next. He comes down a little further in verse 21. He starts to tell his apostles, I'm going to Jerusalem. I'm going to suffer. I'm going to die and be raised the third day. What's Peter's response? Oh, Lord, be it far from thee. This shall not happen. That's what Peter said. And look at Jesus' response. Get behind me, Satan, for thou savorest not the things that be of God, but the things that are of man. He just switched over from you're speaking something my Father's revealed to, now you're speaking something you got from man. I just told you I'm going to suffer, die, and be raised again. God just told you that. So for you to come up to me and say, no, that's not going to happen, you're messing with heaven now. That's what Jesus said. You're messing with heaven. You've now gone to your earthly mindset and you're messing with something heavenly. I have to die on the cross. You remember in John 3, verse 14? He said, when the Son is lifted up on the cross, what's that going to be patterned at? What's patterned after that? The serpent being lifted up on the pole. His death had to happen. There's too much typology, if you will. There's too much heavenly pattern that's involved in too many things. Go to Matthew chapter 12 with me. Matthew chapter 12. Jesus had to be raised the third day. But look at Matthew 12 and verse 38. Matthew 12 and verse 38. They ask Jesus for a sign, don't they? Matthew 12, verse 38. And Jesus says, this wicked and adulterous generation, they're always asking for signs, and no signs shall be given them, but with the exception of the sign of the prophet Jonas. He says, here's a sign for them. If they want a sign, and this generation needs a sign, I will give you the sign of the prophet Jonas. That's what he says in verse 40. And he says, as Jonas was in the whale's belly 3 days and 3 nights, so shall the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. I don't think we sometimes fully appreciate the level at which Jesus is teaching this. So go to Jonah chapter 1 so we can understand it. He has just made the resurrection of Jesus after the third day and tied it to Jonah. Jonah's not the only one, by the way. You recall in John 11, prior to Jesus' crucifixion, John chapter 11, Jesus raised Lazarus. Remember, before the raising of Lazarus, they said, hey, he's sick. And Jesus said, I'm going to wait around for 2 more days because he just sleeps. And they said, well, if he sleeps, then he does well. No, he's dead, but I got to wait around for 2 days because when he arrives on the scene, he will have been dead for 4 days. Do you remember that? And then Jesus, so that the people around can know what's happening, said, Father, thank you for answering my prayer. Do you remember that? And he says, that I'm doing this for you to hear this, so that you will know prior to my death that my Father in heaven can raise someone who's been dead for 4 days. Well, if he can raise someone who's been dead for 4 days, what can he also do? Raise someone who's been dead for 3 days. It's almost like God's trying to prepare them for what's coming. But in the book of Jonah, now that you're there, Jonah chapter 1 and verse 3, remember, he's trying to escape the prophecy, the responsibility God has given him. And he's on the ship going to Tarshish. He's heading west. God wanted him to head northeast, and he's heading west. And you remember that this great storm happens, not by circumstance, but by the God of heaven who controls the seas. There are mariners on that boat with him. And they start to wonder what he's asleep, and they're thinking, what in the world's going on? Now they're mariners, so they know what's typical, and they're thinking this is not typical. Look in verse 8. Look what they start asking. They basically ask, what's your occupation? They get his resume. What's your occupation? Where are you from? Who are your people? That's what they're asking in verse 8. We got to find everything out about this man. And then he goes on. Look in verse 10. What happens? They knew that he was running from God. How did they know that? Because he told them that. Jonah 1 and verse 10. I want you to think about this. These mariners have now have heard from Jonah where he's from, what his job is, the fact that the God in heaven, his God, has sent him to Nineveh, their home, by the way, and he's told them go and prophesy there, and I'm supposed to go there, but I'm running away. That's what he reveals. That go down to verse 16. So remember, they throw him off the boat, and they're thinking this man is dead. They're thinking this man is dead. They throw him off the boat. They arrive back, and in verse 16, what do? They offer sacrifices to Jehovah, not their gods, to Jehovah. They also make vows. Does everybody see that, vows? Now, if you write in your Bibles, if you want to make notes, make the note of chapter 2, verse 9. They're taking, in my opinion, the vow of Jonah in chapter 2, verse 9. See the vow of Jonah in chapter 2, verse 9? His vow was, I'm supposed to go according to God and go preach to these people. So what if, and notice in verse 17 also, what had God prepared? He had prepared a well to take care of man's disobedience. Remember what God the Father prepared in order to take care of our disobedience? Hebrews 10 verse 5, a body. He prepared a body to take care of our disobedience. He prepared a well to take care of Noah's disobedience. Imagine, if you will, these men going back to Nineveh, and they're telling the whole city, man, we met this man, there's this huge storm, we kicked him off the boat, so he's drowned on the bottom of the sea out there. Jehovah, all these things happen, and then lo and behold, what happens? A few days later, in walks Jonah to that very city, and they're thinking, you were supposed to be dead. That's the level we're at here. When Jesus talks about the Jonah, and the message of Jonah is this man's supposed to be dead, but look what we see now. We see him walking around in this very city, which is what Jesus was going to do, walk around the very city where they saw him die, crucified, and then came back to life. It has to happen. So Peter, if you say, no, Jesus is not going to be raised the third day, you're messing with heaven. You're messing with too much heaven when you start to deny things like that. That's all that's being described there. Go with me, if you will, to Hebrews chapter 9. Hebrews chapter 9. And go with me verse 24. Hebrews 9, verse 24. And so, I want to introduce, hopefully I've laid the groundwork here for the concept of types and antitypes, but there's a third level that sometimes we overlook, which is the overarching level that controls all the other two. In Hebrews 9, verse 24, there's several words I want you to note there. I want you to first of all note that where Jesus went, this is talking about Jesus after he was raised, after he ascended, after he went back to the Father. Where he went was not built with man's hands. So now we can eliminate the possibility of it being the physical tent. So I can eliminate the type from what he's talking about here. And then he also says he also did not go into the figure. Look that word up. It's not tupos, it's antitupos. So what he's just said is Jesus didn't even go into the antitype. So then he goes into Hebrews 9, verse 24, where he actually went into. He went into the true. Everybody see that? Heaven itself, the presence of God, Hebrews 9, verse 24. Is everybody with me? That is the highest level. Heaven is the highest level. So as we study types and antitypes, I want to put in your mind that you understand there's a third level higher than both of those. It's called heaven itself. It's the true reality that everything else is based off of. So go to the book of Revelation, Revelation chapter 4. So the beauty of the book of Revelation, many of the beauties of the book of Revelation, one of them is you in a vision get to see glimpses of heaven in a vision. In Revelation chapter 4, verse 1, Revelation 4 and verse 1, John's going to describe the fact that a door was opened in heaven. This is a vision. Remember that we're talking about signs and things are being signified to him. We talked about that figurative language, but this is in a vision. In Hebrews 4, verse 1, the door is open to heaven, and a voice says, come hither. That's come see what's in heaven. So when he enters into this vision, when he goes to this open door, if you will, and he sees heaven, we're going to get to the throne. That's what everything is centered around, is the throne. But there's several things that he notes as he looks upon the throne. He first of all goes me to verse 6, Revelation 4 and verse 6. I want you to note one thing that he notes before the throne. He notes a sea of glass. Does everybody see that sea of glass? Now, in your notes, or in your Bible, or wherever you write, or in your mind, whichever, I would write 1 Chronicles 18 and verse 8, 1 Chronicles 18 and verse 8, wherein the laver is referred to as the bronze or brazen sea, Chronicles 18 and verse 8. What you have in this picture of the sea of glass is that the contrast between the bronze sea, the brazen sea of the Old Testament, which would have been just for your, I'm try not to get too far into people's lessons, but just for your information for the purpose of this, that sea would have been where a priest, having offered the offering of the animals with the blood and the offering, they would go to the laver and they would wash before they went to the tabernacle. Therefore, the water in that laver was going to be mixed with water, blood, and the dirt from their hands. Water and blood was mixed in that laver. We'll see that second level in a second. But I want you to note the laver had water and blood in it as they washed, and it was constantly being stirred, was it not? Because that's one of the contrasts in the book of Hebrews between Jesus, the high priest, and the priests of the Levitical priesthood. Because they stood daily, and they did the same sacrifices over and over and over again. Those waters were constantly stirred and constantly being used because they were constantly offering the blood of animals. But the sea that you see in heaven, this heavenly image, is calm and it's clear. Calm because it's not being stirred. Clear because there's no need for that sacrifice anymore in it. There's no contaminants. There's no dirt. It's completely pure. As he goes a little bit further, go to verse 5. Revelation 4 and verse 5. You need to see the other thing he sees there. 7 flames of fire. 7 lamps of fire. It's not 6. It's not 13. It's not 12. I wonder why it's 7. I wonder what's so significant about that. When you see within the tabernacle, you go into the tabernacle, you have the candlestick, which you already noted in Numbers chapter 8 and verse 4, is based on a pattern of something heavenly. He says you want to make 3 here, 3 here, and 1 down the middle of the shaft. That equals 7. God did not say to Moses, make the lampstand with however many, how many branches you want. It can be 4, it can be 13. You choose, Moses. He said 7. Why 7? It needs to look heavenly to God. He's giving a pattern of something heavenly. You know, as you go further within the tabernacle, you also have the altar of incense. Now, altar of incense is where they would go and they burn the incense on that altar, and you get the smoke from that altar. That's described in Revelation 5 and verse 8. And Revelation 5 and verse 8 tells you what that is. It's the prayers of the saints. Revelation 5 and verse 8. But you have the picture of that being poured forth before God. There's not liquids being poured in heaven. This is imagery. This is typology. Here it's prayers being poured out before the throne of God. You obviously have within this picture the throne itself. And in Revelation chapter 4, you have the Father sitting on the throne. I know this because in chapter 5, the Lamb is going to step up to the right hand of the Father on the throne and take the book that no one else could. And now he's on the right hand. He's going to open that book. So now you have God the Father on the throne, the Lamb standing on the right hand of the Father, and they are the throne. And it's as if the throne is where God was going to meet. That's where God was. And isn't that the mercy seat of the tabernacle where God says, I'm going to meet you? There's a book there too in the Old Testament. You have the law, the commandments of God that were contained within the Ark, the covenant. It was all there beside God. And not only do you have that book, Revelation chapter 20, as Terrence mentioned, you have Revelation 20, the judgment day scene. The judgment day scene, the books that are before God are open and everyone's judged out of them. Revelation chapter 20. The books are right there before the throne. I hope we can fully appreciate and understand what's happening here. What's happening here is heaven is revealing a pattern unto man and saying, follow this pattern closely, because when I look down, I want to see something heavenly, and I want to hear something heavenly when this thing goes through the pattern that God gave. And it's only going to look that way, and it's only going to sound that way if you follow the pattern. That's typology. Now, the next level after the heaven level, as we're going to see throughout the next few days, is the church. The church is the antitype. You're going to see all the same things. You're going to see the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, which is available to the whole world, which replaces the blood of bulls and goats. You're going to have that bronze laver, which is baptism, the antitype being baptism, wherein people will say, oh, why is water involved in salvation? Water's involved in salvation, not only because God specifically said water's involved, but also because it's typology. It's heavenly. Water's involved because heaven said it's involved. You have to follow that pattern. And so that water is what separates the priests from the non-priests, isn't it? The water separates the priest from the non-priests. So you have to be washed in order to be a priest. And we would say in the antitype of the church, you have to be washed in order to be a priest today in God's church. It is the entrance through which you enter into the church, the tabernacle. That's the antitype. And you have within the church, you have the example of Christians, the Christian example that should always be burning. You have the fellowship we have with one another. You have the prayers of the saints, all seeing the antitype. And then at the lowest level, you have the type. The type is the first one. And you start to ask yourself, well, I don't understand. How is it that the type, the lowest one, on a timeline of mankind came 1,500 years before the thing that was based off of? How can that be? How can it be that the sacrifice of Jesus is based on something that happened 15 years later? How is it that the tabernacle, which was 1,500 years before the church, the tabernacle was based off the church? How is that the case? Well, Paul reveals that to us, doesn't he? In Ephesians chapter 3, verses 9 and 10, it's because the church wasn't in God's mind after the tabernacle. The church was in God's mind before the tabernacle. Since the foundation of the world, Ephesians 3, 9 and 10. That's why it happened. The tabernacle had to look like the church, not the church like the tabernacle. How is it that the animal sacrifice and the altar, the bronze altar, is patterned after Jesus Christ on the cross when he happened over 1,500 years later? How can that be? John reveals that to us, doesn't he? Revelation 13 verse 8. Revelation 13 verse 8, the lamb which was slain after the tabernacle in 33 AD? No, from the foundation of the world, because that was in God's heavenly plan from before the tabernacle. That's how that's the case. So what we shouldn't do, sometimes we present Jesus going to Jerusalem, wherein one of those mountains was Mount Moriah, the other was Mount Zion, and we say, oh, look how much that looks like Abraham. Wrong. It doesn't look like Abraham. Abraham looks like that. That's why we're getting it backwards. So when you read Genesis chapter 22 and you see him taking his only begotten son, Hebrews 11 verse 17, not only son, not even oldest son, only begotten son, Hebrews 11 verse 17. And he's going to go to Mount Moriah. God said, I got to show you a mountain. Why couldn't he just go to any mountain? Because God had to show him what mountain his son was going to be crucified on. So let me take you to Mount Moriah. And his son just coincidentally carried the wood on which he was going to be sacrificed, right? What a coincidence that was. Or maybe it's typology. And God had that in his plan. He's making it look like what he knew it would look like about 1,500 years later. Maybe that's the case. And maybe when Isaac said to him, we're missing the sacrifice. And God said, believe me, you'll get a lamb. That's what you're waiting for. You're waiting for a lamb. Is because he saw in advance what that needed to look like. We look at Moses in Numbers chapter 20, and he steps up to the rock in Numbers 20. And remember, the first occasion, God told him to strike the rock. The second occasion, he told him to speak to the rock, didn't he? And Moses, instead of speaking to it because of the anger he had for the people around him, he struck the rock instead. Water came forth nonetheless, by the way. There's a lesson in that. Water came forth nonetheless. But he struck it until he was speaking to it. That kept him out of the promised land. And people think, well, what a harsh consequence to keep Moses out. All that man went through, and that's keeping out of the promised land. It's not harsh if you understand typology. Because in John chapter 4, Jesus walks up to the woman at the well, and he said, if you asked, I could have given you living water. If you just asked, I would have given you living water. But instead, what the Jews are going to do, not the Samaritans, what the Jews are going to do is strike him and beat him. And so we say to ourselves, why did God go so harsh with Moses? Because 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 4 says the rock that followed them was Christ. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 4. And verse 11 tells us that's an ensample. Look it up, tupos. It's a type. So God looked down upon what Moses did. Instead of coming up and requesting the water, he struck it instead. He saw in that what the Jews were going to do his only begotten son 1,500 years later. That's what the Bible is doing with this. The highest level being what is known and revealed from heaven. Matthew chapter 2, we'll end with this one in Matthew chapter 2. All the things that happen in the book of Genesis to bring about the people of Israel winding up in Egypt. And we think, why Egypt? Was that just happenstance? Was it coincidence that the people of God ended up in Egypt? Or perhaps, did God already have a plan in mind to call his children, Israel, out of Egypt? In Matthew 2, verse 15, him calling them out of Egypt, his child Israel out of Egypt, had to be patterned after what? Calling Jesus out of Egypt. So all the things at the end of the book of Genesis, all those things that happened with Joseph, and we're thinking, well, what a coincidence. Wasn't Joseph lucky? He wasn't lucky. God's in control in the kingdoms of men, and Joseph had to be in Egypt so that God could call his people out of Egypt, because he knew he was going to call his son out of Egypt. Matthew 2, verse 15. It's just typology. So when you mess around with doctrine, you mess around with heaven. That's what we're looking at over the next few days. So when we go through these things the next few days, make sure you're paying attention to what the Bible has to say. It's more than just, oh, that's neat, that's really cool. It's more than that. It's deeper than that. This is the revelation of God from heaven on things that he had planned thousands of years before they happened. That is the wisdom and the forethought and the foreknowledge, Acts chapter 2, according to the foreknowledge and counsel of God you've taken by wicked hands and crucified Jesus. Foreknowledge means he knew it was going to happen. It was also part of his plan, Isaiah 53. Thank y'all.